My name is Melina Platas, and I'm an assistant professor of political science at New York University in Abu Dhabi.
What does it take to start a field research project in Uganda? I mean, what questions do you want to ask yourself?
First of all, you need to first ask a question, why do voters vote the way they do? You need assumptions around, do people actually have information to vote on?
What happened with the electoral reforms that we have been demanding all these years? Because when you have an electoral commission, which we consider independent, very credible, well-financed.
So I think this kind of project is a great example for where we have questions that are important from both an academic perspective, but also really have policy relevance in terms of what kind of programs work in increasing accountability. And we would not be able to answer them without actually going to the field and really rigorously testing the effectiveness of interventions, talking to politicians, talking to voters.
A research project like this requires that you begin very far in advance from when you actually want to begin collecting data. First, you have to know what previous research has been done, what the questions are, what do we know already and what don't we know, and how can you design a research project such that you're able to advance knowledge further. You also need to create a collaboration and gather the input of potentially interested partners and those who you may work with in implementing such a project. So for example, for this project, before we did anything on the ground, before we designed any survey, before we collected any data, we first talked to political parties, we talked to organizations who work in governance, and other interested partners to make sure that we could design an intervention that was appropriate for this context and for understanding the politics of Uganda. In this project, we filmed candidates who are standing for Member of Parliament, and we're trying to determine how watching videos of candidates and candidates sharing their policy positions affected voters' behavior. Perhaps there's a difference in how voters respond to information between primary and general elections. Somehow, when they get good news about candidates, they may be more willing to switch. In the primary election, perhaps when party is held constant, they're not switching from NRM to something else. All the candidates are in.
First, you have to understand the dynamics in the areas you're collecting data from. So, for example, if you went and gone, say you're going to collect data, because usually when we collect data, we give some kind of gifts and rewards. But you're collecting data at a period when it's a general election, like it was with MTC. If you have not done your homework to know what is the atmosphere, what are the rival camps, what are people saying, you may be misconstrued to be bribing voters. So I think one of the issues, besides the hard stuff I've talked about, is knowing, having your ear on the ground on what are the local dynamics. It is important that, you already explain to the respondents, but not only the respondents, but also to the local leaders, as LC1, RDC, what the study is all about. Why? Because political studies by themselves are sensitive. You go to collect data in areas which are politically pluralized, opposition versus NRM, and then you'll be collecting data on people's attitudes towards politicians. So one of the challenges we've had, sometimes we've gone to the field, collected data, and before you know it, there are calls that are made higher up, and people are saying, look, there are people here, they're asking people about their political opinions.
This research, for instance, I don't think people would have given debate much time or thought. But from the looks of it, changed here, adjusted there, candidates' debates are very crucial. They do inform and maybe change opinions.
Principle is that debates should be held together. How often, where, those are details. But I think it is very important to have these candidates face the same audience, the same questions, and address the people.
I think there is no doubt that for policy-making process to have impact, it must be data-driven. The starting point for having better policies that impact lives is that they must be evidence-based, they must be driven from research. So there is no option. If we have to expand our democracy and make it better, there is no doubt that we shall have to invest more in research.
Well, so I think the event today raised a lot of really interesting questions, both in terms of further analysis that we can do with the rich data that we have, but also in terms of policy. So how can we scale this up? How can we make it more useful? And how can it, in particular, I think one of the things that came out, so we have some positive results on the effectiveness of these kinds of political debates. But the kind of intervention that we did, the kind of study that we did, is really more a proof of concept. And now the big question is, how do you actually take that to scale? And this is where radio comes in as a much cheaper way than TV, for example, and where I'm hoping that the people who were in the room today can really take this forward to the next level. And we, of course, hope to be involved in that.
I think what we've learned from this exercise is that watching candidate debates, watching videos of candidates sharing their experience, their background, their policy positions, actually does influence voters and shapes the way they behave. So some people assume that policy doesn't matter, it's all about the political party or ethnicity or money or vote buying or something like that. And I think we can show in this project that actually people do care about the quality of the candidates that are seeking to represent them in office in terms of their policy, in terms of their background experience, in terms of how they're able to express their views. And so from this, I think we can learn both from a theoretical standpoint, the fact that these factors do matter for voters' decisions, and also going forward, it's possible that other partners, perhaps in the media, perhaps civil society, political parties themselves, might be interested in taking up this kind of intervention and doing candidate debates or holding some kind of platform where candidates stand on the same platform and answer questions, talk with one another, justify their positions. That kind of activity could perhaps be scaled up more broadly in advance of the next elections.